Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better. A lot of times people say to me, I get out of the opening and I don't know what to do, or I get out of my opening book and I don't know what to do. And, one of the easy answers to that is, well, finish developing all your pieces. If you don't have all your pieces in the game, then your opening's probably not complete. But then they say something like, well, I'm not really sure how I should do that or what order. And sometimes I'll say, all right, what does classical development say you should do next? And they go, what's classical development? So I thought I'd do a basic video on classical development with an eye on maybe hypermodern development as well to contrast. So what does classical development say? Well, I'm only going to move the white pieces. The computer won't let me move just white the pieces, so I'm going to move the black knight back and forth. Just ignore that. So classical development says push out a center pawn, push out another center pawn, move out the knight toward the center that you're on the side you're trying to castle, get out the bishop on the side you're trying to castle, get out the knight on the other side, get out the bishop on the other side, get the queen up, get one of the rooks doing something, and get the other rook doing something. So this is basic classical development. It's to get all the pieces out and to do it somewhat in the order that I just said. So let's go through that one more time and then we'll start talking about the pros and cons of doing this. All right, let's bring it back again. So the classical development says move out a center pawn 2 squares, move out another center pawn 2 squares, move out the knight on the side you're going to castle toward the middle, move out the bishop on the same side you're going to castle as soon as you can, get the other knight out where it's doing something, get the bishop out where it's doing something on the other side from where you castled, get your queen out, get a rook doing something, get the other rook doing something. Okay, so in a very vague sense, this is what you're trying to do every opening. You're trying to castle, get your rooks into the game, get your minor pieces out, don't move any piece twice. Be as efficient as possible at getting your entire army developed. Now, what's wrong with this position? Well, nothing's wrong with it per se, but when you only bring out 2 pawns in the opening, it really doesn't give you enough space and flexibility to fight for the center when your opponent's going to be using more than 2 pawns against you. So what you very often see is good players use a third central pawn like the F pawn or the C pawn. For instance, let's just do the exact same thing and move the C pawn up. So let's go back, move out a center pawn, move out another center pawn, move the knight on the side we're going to castle, move the bishop on the side we're going to castle, and now let's move up an extra pawn. And now we'll put the knight behind that pawn instead of in front of it. And now we'll develop our bishop. Let's say here we'll go g5, it doesn't matter. Knight back, get the queen out, rook over, let's say rook over here. Okay, so this took an extra tempo for white to get the extra pawn out, but this is actually a much better position for white. He's got a lot more space. He's got a lot more center control. So a position like this is a lot easier to play. Suppose your opponent is not a very good player and you play e4 and he plays like h6. What should you do? Well, what you should do is grab the center. You should play d4. But let's say he keeps doing stuff like this and he plays a6. Well, a lot of people here start bringing out their knights in front of their pawns. But actually, what you should do, and if you watch the last game I played against the computer, I think the computer let me do this. It might not have been in my YouTube series, I'm not sure. But anyway, I just kept pushing pawns out to the 4th rank. Every time he would waste more time, I would push more pawns out. And now I had tremendous center control here. And, black has to try to fight against this, and right away it's easy for me to drive his knights out of the middle if he tries to bring his knights out. So when your opponent doesn't stop you, putting a bunch of pawns in the center is usually a pretty good idea. Let's take a look at the Pierce defense. In the Pierce defense, white plays e4, black plays d6, white plays d4, black plays knight f6, and white plays knight c3 to guard the pawn. And now black plays a hypermodern move. Hypermodern moves are not occupying the center, but trying to control the center from afar, especially with bishop fianchettos. A fianchetto is where you push up a knight pawn one square and then put the bishop behind it. So black plays g6, a hypermodern move. A lot of times, white plays knight f3 here. And knight f3 is a perfectly good move. If you ask the computer, it's going to tell you it's one of the very best moves. And it gives white a very nice center control and a very nice central game. But a lot of players don't like to do this. When I say a lot of players, I mean a lot of strong players don't like to play so passively. They'll play something more akin to like f3, and then bishop e3, and then queen to d2, and castle queenside. This is the 150 attack. This extra pawn in the middle to guard the e-pawn gives white a lot more flexibility. He's got a lot more pawns to fight in the center when black tries to counterbreak with e5 or c5. Also, white could play the old Austrian attack with f4. Again, a very aggressive way of playing it, bringing out 3 pawns and trying to control these 5 squares in the center here on the 5th rank. So when you do stuff like this, yes, it opens up your king a little bit, which you have to always be a little careful, but you'll get your king out of there. And it does spend an extra tempo where you didn't bring out a piece, but it brings out extra pawns to grab space. And if you play over lots of Grandmaster games, if you read annotated books, you'll see that almost every Grandmaster opening, they're using way more than 2 pawns in the opening. They're using 3, 4, 5, even 6 sometimes, right in the opening to try to gain as much space as they can. And that's the problem with pure classical development, is it tells you to get all your pieces out, which is very good. It tells you to control the center, which is very good. It tells you to make sure to move your rooks, which is very good. It tells you to move every piece once before you move any piece twice, which is exceptionally good. It just doesn't get enough space for the pieces. All right, so let's go back and talk a little bit about hypermodern openings. Hypermodern openings, as I just said, are openings where you control the center, not by, let's say, occupy. Let's say you're putting your bishop out here. That's occupying the center with your bishop and trying to control it that way. What a hypermodern opening would do is to, let's say, fianchetto the bishop and control the center squares without occupying them, so that you kind of use it as a shooting gallery, and you're shooting down, those squares. You're controlling those squares so your opponent can't easily put his pieces there. That's what hypermodern development does. So to go super hypermodern here, we could fianchetto both bishops. That's pretty rare. Usually it's one or the other. But I'm just making silly moves here. See both sides. Now we have 2 double fianchettos, super hypermodern. So before the hypermoderns kind of invented hypermodern chess, back almost exactly 100 years ago now, people used to play all classical. For instance, when white played d4, black always played d5. If white played c4, black guarded the center with e6, or with c6, or maybe d takes c4. But when the hypermoderns came along, they said there's other ways to stop white from playing e4. The hypermoderns said, let's bring out a knight first to control that square. We don't need to commit our central pawn there yet. And if white went ahead and played c4, the hypermoderns said, well, we don't have to play a central pawn up 2 squares yet. We could play like e6. And if white plays knight c3, we don't have to transpose into the queen's gambit. We can pin that knight so white can't easily play e4. And this is the Nimzo Indian. The Indian comes from the fact that the knight is on f6 first after d4 rather than playing d5. Nimzo is short for Nimzovich, so they called this the Nimzo Indian. Ernst Grunfeld came up with his idea, which is to play g6 and after knight c3 to play d5, sort of combining hypermodern with g6 with more classical with d5, and this became the Grunfeld defense, still very popular today. Or white can let black set up a completely big center. He can play bishop to g7, and white play e4, and black now plays d6. This is the main line of the King's Indian. Why are these Indians? Because it's, again, going back to the first move, if you play knight f6 and you don't transpose into these Queen's Gambit-y kind of positions, these are the Indian defenses. For instance, you could play the Benoni. They don't call it the Benoni Indian, but Benoni is an Indian defense. You bring out the knight first. If white plays knight f3, then black could play b6 and Fianchetto that way, since white's not threatening e4. That's called the Queen's Indian. So we have these different hypermodern openings. One of the things that the hypermodern openings also did was open up more ideas for white to defend e4. So for instance, before the hypermoderns, we saw mostly e4, e5 with some dabbling of other openings. Once the hypermoderns started to say you could attack the center from the side, now we saw the rise of things like the Sicilian defense. The Sicilian defense says, sure, white, if you want to play the pawn up to d4, you can, but I'll get a chance right away to trade off my side pawn for your center pawn, and I'll have a majority of center pawns. So black's trying to control the center from the side. White said, all right, if you want to do that, I can do that upside down. I can play c4 on the first move, which is the English opening. And if black plays e5, we now have a Sicilian defense, but with the colors reversed, with white having an extra move. So sometimes people refer to this kind of defense against the English as being a Sicilian reversed. There's other ideas when you play c4 and try to control the center. For instance, if black does play a move here like knight f6, you can play g3 and Fianchetto, and now you're adding an extra hypermodern way of controlling that d5 square. Your bishop on g2 is going to control d5 after c4. Now you could start the game with g3 right away. Banco opening, that lets black play d5 right away and try to fight for that square. That's one of the reasons why the English is a little bit more popular than the Banco system. A lot of people play knight f3 first with the idea of transposing into something. If black plays d5 and white plays c4 right away, this is the pure ready system. And again, ready was one of the hypermoderns. The three big hypermoderns were Richard Redi, Aaron Nimzowitsch, and Julius Breyer. Unfortunately, Julius Breyer passed away in, well, if he didn't pass away in World War I, he passed away as a result of World War I. And he, I think, died at the age of maybe 23. And he's famous for a line in the Ruy Lopez. We talked about this very briefly in my first video on the closed Ruy Lopez. So the Ruy Lopez is a classical opening. Notice we're moving pawns in the center. We're not Fianchettoing anything. We're getting ready to castle. This is all pure classical. Black attacks the bishop. We have to save it. He develops a knight. White castles as soon as he can. Black closes the e-file so he can threaten to take the pawn. White guards the pawn. Now he's threatening to remove the guard and win the e-pawn. Black stops him from removing the guard. Black plays d6. White plays c3. Black plays castle. And now if white plays d4, bishop g4 is fairly strong, so white usually plays h3 first. And this is the Tabia position that we talked about in the earlier video on the closed Ruy Lopez. And Julius Breyer's line here, which seems very paradoxical and certainly more in the hypermodern spirit than a classical spirit, Julius Breyer's idea was to move the knight back to b8. That looks like an undeveloping move, but it's actually not. What it does is it gets the knight out of the way so you can move the pawn up and attack the center from the side, just like the hypermoderns wanted, and it repositions the knight to d7. So for instance, if white plays d4, black can attack the e-pawn again. If white guards it, black can now, for instance, continue to develop his knight back to d7, or he could, I guess knight d7 is probably the most logical move to guard the pawn. And, this is Breyer's line. So even though this is a fairly classical opening, we have a hypermodern twist to it. After e4, besides the Sicilian, obviously we've got some semi-classical moves that were played before the hypermoderns, like the French defense and the caro-can. But the hypermoderns also said, well, you could attack the pawn right away. And this is named after the world champion from 1927 through 1946 when he passed away, Alexander Alekhine. He beat Capablanca in 1927, refused to give him a rematch. Knight f6. Alekhine did not play this all the time, but he played it enough that they named it after him. It's a hypermodern defense because it entices white to set up a big center, and now black can try to break down the center. Here, white could even play f4, the four-pawn attack. Black's going to play something like pawn takes, pawn takes, and then it's going to play like knight c6, knight f3, and then maybe bishop out to g4 or bishop f5. Let's see, Stockfish, which bishop move you like better? Computer says bishop g4 is better. Bishop g4. Black's going to play e6 and indirectly put pressure on the center. Maybe later he'll move this knight and break with c5. So this is definitely a hypermodern kind of way of playing the opening. You entice white to set up a big center, and then you try to chop at it. Let's show another example of that. Let's go back to our King's Indian. Again, Indian because the knight goes to f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4. So 99 times out of 100, black plays d6. The idea is to stop e5, which would now be a really bad move because after pawn takes, queen takes queen, if white wants to retain his castling advantages, he has to play knight takes. But then knight g4 hits this pawn twice. It's only guarded 0 times, so white would have to guard with something less. And already black's doing very well. Right here, Stockfish 10 says that black could even start to break up the center with f6, a perfectly safe move with the queens off the board. And black already has a nice advantage here. He could play f6, or he could delay f6 and play knight c6 first. And again, black's already better. Suppose white had taken with the king, so the knight was stayed out. Well, now knight to g4 is winning a pawn because there's a double threat. There's a threat to not only win the pawn on f2, but fork the king and the rook. And also knight takes e5, and white can't stop both threats because if he plays f4, then knight f2, check, wins the rook. So black's already winning in this line. So that's what black normally does, is he plays d6. What Bobby Fischer did in his famous game against Letellier is he said, I don't even really need to do that. I could play completely hypermodern and play castle. And now if white plays e5, I can just bring my knight back to e8. And even though that looks like I'm losing time, I now have a punching bag of a center to hit white's pawns. So let's say white plays f4 here. Then black can start breaking it up with d6. And if white plays knight f3, black can play pawn takes pawn. And if pawn takes pawn, he can play c5. And the pawns are being undermined. For instance, if white now plays d5, then bishop g4 threatens to remove the guard and take this pawn. If white tries to save it, black can keep attacking it. And the computer says that black has a really pretty substantial opening advantage here of about 0.4 pawns after queen e2, queen to b8, or queen to c7. He's not sure which one's better. Hitting this pawn a third time, threatening to remove the guard. And the pawn is pinned to the bishop, so white's got some problems. So, in this position, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, when people don't play d6 and they play castles, a lot of times here, white says, no, I'm not going to fall for that stuff. I'm just going to transpose back into the book. And he plays like bishop e2. And at some point, black has to agree to play d6 anyway. Computer says d6 is the best move. So in a sense, Fischer's game where he enticed white to play e5, e5 is not even the best move, even it looks like it's trying to refute black not playing d6. again, we've got this classical play for white and hypermodern play for black, and it's kind of a clash of ideas. But most modern openings are an amalgamation of these ideas. You use certain classical ideas and you use certain hypermodern ideas. Let's look at another opening. Let's say white plays d4 and black plays d5. Well, we don't always have to play strictly classical. We could, for instance, Fianchetto our bishop now with g3. This is known as the Catalan system. So white is saying, all right, I'll start classically, and then I'm going to Fianchetto. So that's a perfectly good way of playing a Queen's Gambit decline, is to Fianchetto here with g3. You know, we could just keep looking at more and more ideas like this. You see these combinations in lots of openings. In the Sicilian, if white plays kind of classically and plays knight f3, d6, d4, pawn takes, knight f6, knight c3, black could play more hypermodern and play a dragon and Fianchetto the bishop. Computers don't like that as much these days, so it's not being played as much at the grandmaster level, but at the amateur level, perfectly good opening to play it like a hypermodern move. On the other hand, black could play a Nahdorf a6, which looks a little mysterious. That looks like that doesn't follow classical development. And a little bit it doesn't, but it turns out that that move works by keeping the knights off of b5. It allows black to move the e-pawn without having the knights attack the d6 pawn. So we have, again, these amalgamation of ideas. White could, if he wanted, Fianchetto against the Sicilian. In fact, even here in the Nahdorf, I guess I shouldn't go back, there's a rare line where white says, I have this nice diagonal for the bishop, but I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to Fianchetto my bishop like that. Let's look at the Sveshnikov. In the Sveshnikov, we see some unusual bouts between hypermodern and classical. So far, it's pretty classical, although c5 itself is a little hypermodern. And now black plays e5, which creates some weak squares here, and plays d6, bishop g5, a6, knight there. And here black would play b5. And now if white plays bishop takes f6, black takes with the pawn, and on knight d5 he can hit at the center with f5, or he could first play bishop g7, which doesn't really look like a Fianchetto because there's no pawn there, but it's a very hypermodern kind of move, and black here is ceding white a lot of control of the center so that he can attack it from the side and use his bishop pair. So we're seeing, again, kind of a clash of classical ideas with hypermodern ideas. One of the openings that I sometimes play is a Botvinnik system for white. You play c4, and now black has a variety of things he can play. Let's say he plays hypermodern and Fianchettos the bishop, and I say I'm going to Fianchetto my bishop too, and let's say he plays e5, bishop g2, and he plays, let's say, d6. Well, if white wants, he can play d4 there, but e4 would be a Botvinnik system, and now knight c6, knight ge2, and instead of putting its knights on the best square, we leave the Fianchetto bishop unblocked. Black could sort of do the same thing if he wants. White castles, black castles, white plays d3. So we see here with the English, we're indirectly guarding the central squares from the side, a very hypermodern idea. We're Fianchettoing our bishop, and black's Fianchettoing his bishop. Would this work if black didn't Fianchetto his bishop? Yeah, in a lot of lines it could. For instance, c4, e5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2. Let's say black just decides to play a wimpy move like bishop e7. I could still play e4 to clamp down on the d5 square. Knight c3, castles. You know, let's say black doesn't want to put his knight on c6 because then it's very hard for him to get. So let's say he plays, instead after knight ge2, he plays c6. So he can try to play d5. Now that's why I don't want my knight on f3, because I want my bishop on g2, also controlling that square in a very hypermodern way. And now white can castle. Computer says the best move is d4, sort of transposing into an old Indian with a fianchetto bishop. But you could stay with a Botvinnik and castle. If black plays bishop e6 to hit your pawn. You could either play b3 here to fianchetto the bishop. We'd have a double fianchetto like a hypermodern, with the idea of playing d4. Or we could play a straight Botvinnik with d3, where our break move becomes f4. Okay, so what you're seeing over and over again is when you get taken out of your book, you have these classical and hypermodern ideas to help you complete your development. For instance, one last thing. Suppose black decides to play like a queen's fianchetto kind of opening. Usually white plays e4 and gets the big center, but let's pretend he didn't know to do that. What would be the next pawn that black should move? Well, if white goes here, the logical move for black is not to play a move like d6, which opens up a diagonal where there's no bishop. The logical move here is to play something like e6 to open up the other bishop. And then if white tries to get a big center with e4, black can pin the knight like an Animzo Indian. And now, let's say white plays, well, white has to save this pawn. If he saves it by moving the bishop out, black could actually play f5 and get a crazy line where the e pawn is pinned to the g2 pawn. White could also just play f3, and there we have those several central pawns again, which is an enhancement on the classical idea. So here black's defending in a hypermodern way, and white's trying to defend not only classically, but the extended classical, where he has more pawns in the center. And then black's going to try to bite at the center here. Maybe he'll play bishop takes to double the pawns, and then d6 and then c5 to try to fix the white pawns to attack. Something like that. There's various things to do. And these same ideas occur over and over and over and over again. And the more you learn them, the more you watch what the good players are doing, you watch how the main openings are played, the more that when you get out of your opening book, you'll be able to use these ideas. And of course, you always have to check for safety. Safety comes first. But you'll be able to use these ideas to finish your development and make sure all your pieces are doing something. So if you keep in mind the ideas of classical development, the principles of classical development, the enhancements with the extra pawns, the hypermodern development, all these ideas are going to play into how you're going to get your pieces out so that all your pieces are doing something. They're not in each other's way. They're all coordinated. They're controlling the center. And there's many ways to skin the cat. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but the more you see what the good ones are, the better you should be able to play and not get lost as soon as you get taken out of your book moves. Okay, this is Dan Heisman. We'll see you next time. Bye.